road. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah McAnulty. I run Skype a Scientist. And today we are going to be talking about parasites. We have a scientist with us who studies just that. We got Joanna Cielocha will be talking all about, she'll be showing us some pictures of what her work looks like, what kind of answers she's looking for, what those parasites look like under the microscope, the whole thing. So we're happy to have you here. If you have questions, that's what we're here for. So please submit them to the Q&A as you have them. We will get to as many as we can as possible over the next 45 minutes. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Joanna. Take it away.
Okay, give me just 1 second to start my screen share. I'll see if I can do this correctly. If it's gonna. There. Is the right screen being shared? All right. Well, I'm so excited to be here with you all today. And as Sarah discussed, I am a parasitologist, and so I study parasites. And we might just want to start by asking, what is a parasite? So I have a little bit of an outline for what I'm going to talk about today. And that first question is just that. What is a parasite? And then the second question is just how many parasites are there? And then what does a parasitologist do, or a person who studies parasites? So we're going to kind of go through these questions, and hopefully I will be able to answer some of your questions as we go. And then I look forward to more questions when we finish up. So with that first question, what is a parasite? This is a relationship between two different species. So they have to be different species. It can't just be two of the same species. And then that parasite has to either live on its host. So I'm going to pull up my laser pointer here. It can live on its host. So you all have maybe been the host of something like a tick, or it can live in its host. So these yellow cells here are parasites that are bursting out of red blood cells. And then that parasite is going to need to get some food from its host, and it has the ability to cause harm. They might not necessarily cause a lot of harm, but there is the ability for harm to be caused. So those are kind of the basic definitions of parasite. And just like all living things, a parasite has a life cycle it goes through. So it has to develop from an immature form to a mature form. And some parasites have pretty simple life cycles where the immature form, so this is an egg of the parasite, lives in the environment. So it might just be hanging out in the soil. And then if a host, which could be a human or an animal, comes into contact with those eggs, they might ingest them. And then the adult matures in the host. Okay, so that's a pretty simple life cycle. And some parasites have more complex life cycles. And really what that means is that they have more than one host. So I'm just showing you an example here of some animals. And all of these animals, fish, cows, pigs, and many other types of animals might host an immature parasite. And then through our food chain, if that food is prepared improperly or mishandled, if it is infected and another organism eats it, then you can have the adult in those organisms. So this is just a multi-step process where the parasite is in more than one host in order to complete its life cycle. So those are kind of some very background, basic information to share about a parasite, but just how many parasites are there? I find this to be one of the most fascinating questions, and this is really kind of where my area of expertise lies. So let's talk about this really quick. Maybe you've thought about how many organisms live on the earth. And this is like a big family tree of living organisms. These are the eukaryotes. So if you're not familiar with that word, this would be any living thing that has a nucleus. And so that basically excludes viruses. We don't consider them to be living, and it excludes bacteria. But everything else kind of falls under this category. And this figure shows how they're related to one another. And we estimate conservatively, maybe there's 3 to 5 million species of eukaryotes. Okay. And that includes things like plants and animals and fungi, and also single-celled things. But how about the parasites? So this is just broadly, but let's look at the parasites. We have parasitic representatives in all of these groups. Okay. So you might recognize something like a parasitic fungus. These are the mushrooms and their relatives. There's lots of different types of parasitic animals, and there's even parasitic plants, as well as a bunch of other parasitic single-celled organisms. And we think that almost half of all organisms are actually parasites. So parasitism is all over. And so when you look at an organism, you have to kind of put on some imaginary goggles or microscope lenses to see in. And that organism probably is a host of at least one, if not dozens, of parasites. So they're really, really abundant. This is one of the most fascinating things for me to understand, and I'm very curious about how many parasites there are. But for you all, you might be interested in understanding, what does a parasitologist actually do? And so I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an insight. You might not think that you're going to have a career in parasitology, but there's all sorts of disciplines in science that involve parasites. And you might be working with parasites. So you could work in some sort of scientific lab, maybe developing drugs to treat parasites, or to examine specimens to identify parasites. You could work with animals in veterinary medicine, and you might be a veterinarian who is taking care of domestic animals like cats and dogs, or agricultural animals that we see, like livestock, cows, pigs, chickens. All of those organisms also get parasites. Or you could even be working in drug development in animals, so veterinary drug development, or diagnosing. Say you have a dog or a cat that has a parasite. The veterinarian would have to run tests and determine what parasite your animal has. And we also have the human medicine field. So you might be working as a physician, and your patient might be parasitized. And so you would have to order tests and have the knowledge of what kind of parasite that a person has. But also in human medicine, we see people working in the field of epidemiology. So they are tracking where parasites occur and how people encounter them. Or they might be working in public health. They might be working in your communities to make sure that you have safe water to drink, and other measures to prevent parasite transmission. And then you might not be interested in working in veterinary or human medicine, but you might be interested in exploring the environment more broadly. So there's lots of jobs that a parasitologist might do in the environment, from conservation efforts to managing land, working in all sorts of environments across the globe. All of these organisms have parasites, and sometimes those parasites can be bad for an ecosystem. And sometimes parasites indicate that there's a healthy ecosystem, meaning that there's plenty of organisms at each level of the food chain, and everything is kind of working the way it should be. And then there might be something that is going wrong in that ecosystem. And if there's a loss of the normal parasitic fauna there, then that might help you understand that something is going on. Maybe the water is too warm, and that's killing off some of these organisms. So you don't have a healthy ecosystem anymore. And then the last one I was going to mention is more of an academic perspective. And this might be at a university or college, where you focus on primary research of discovering new things. And we'll just leave it broadly, because parasitologists work in all fields of science. or in education, or a combination of the both of those things. So I work at a smaller university, and so I do a lot more teaching, but I also get to do research, and often include undergraduate students. So students who are going to college, the freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior year might do an undergraduate research project with me on my area of expertise, which is what we're going to talk about next. So this is kind of a very broad overview of what I do as a parasitologist, but remember, there's lots of fields of parasitology. First, focusing on discovering diversity. So over the last 20 years, I have been fortunate enough to work with a lot of colleagues all over the country, all over the world, honestly, and had amazing opportunities to travel for research. So I've traveled, the purple circles are places where I have traveled and collected organisms to examine for parasites. One of the main groups of organisms that I study are sharks and rays and their relatives. And then I study the parasites that live in their intestines. So these purple dots represent the areas where I've went and spent time in the field. And I'm going to show you a couple of field photos in a second. And all of these kind of dark green circles, those are places where my colleagues have gone and collected, and then I've had the chance to examine the parasites from those locations. So I've been really fortunate to look at parasites from sharks and rays from all over the world. So I spent some time in Vietnam several years ago. So we were working in fish markets, collecting sharks and rays there and their parasites. I spent some time in Costa Rica. This is the shrimp trawler that we were on. And here we are sorting shrimp. And then later in the evening, we would sort sharks and rays, and then I would look for their parasites. Here we are in South Carolina, working with the Department of Natural Resources to monitor shark breeding and populations. And then I would look at the parasites. And then also in Belize, going out and working with local fishermen to collect sharks and rays. So those are just some of those experiences. And why sharks and rays? It turns out that parasites just love sharks and rays. There's more than 2,000 species of parasites that have been documented from these animals all over the world. And I study really just one group of parasites, and they live in the intestine of sharks and rays. And about half of these parasites are the group of parasites that I work on. So they're really, really cool, and there's lots of them. So this picture, those are all parasites. Those are all what we call tapeworms. And that's specifically just the organ at the anterior part or the top part of the tapeworm. And it uses that organ to attach to the intestine and hang on. Remember, I said that it has to live in or on its host. So these guys live in their host, and they have to get nutrients from their host. So they're going to hang on and attach in their intestine where there's lots of good nutrients and absorb some of that nutrients from the host intestine. And one of the main focuses of my research is naming species. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up, but when I was in college, I had the opportunity to do research, and I got to name new species. And I thought, well, this is really, really cool. And so I kind of stuck with it. So I've named several species of parasites over my career, and still have dozens more that still need names. And what that actually means is that no one else has studied them. We don't know what they look like. We don't know their characteristics. And so what I do is I study them with a microscope and describe all the intricate characteristics about those organisms and compare them to what we already know and say, well, this is different because it doesn't match all these other descriptions of these other species that we know. So that is one of the really, really cool parts of my research, is naming species. But once we have all these names and we know about all these species, we can ask other really, really cool questions about how they're related to each other, what host they're in, or why they're not in other hosts. So again, this is kind of like a family tree showing you the relationships of tapeworms in the group of tapeworms I work on. And they're color coded by kind of their families that they're related to. And then you can see out here what host they're in. This group, weirdly enough, we don't see them in sharks very often. So there's just 3 or 4 species here and here out of the 100 or so that we know of that parasitize sharks. The rest of them all parasitize rays. And some groups only parasitize a certain type of ray, where other groups parasitize lots of different types of rays. And so those are some of the cooler questions we get to ask once we kind of know what they are and where they are found. And so that's all for my introduction. And so I'll take off the sharing, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, we already have 42 questions. Woo. So let's buckle up and get into it. Lori would like to know, we read an article about Toxoplasma gondii and how it affects the behavior of different species and also humans. Can you tell us a little bit about that parasite?
Yeah, so that is a parasite, a single-celled parasite, and humans can get it, but so can lots of other organisms. It has a complex life cycle, so there's multiple hosts. And there have been many studies now that have suggested that humans who have had infections with Toxoplasma may have more aggressive behaviors. I've seen several different studies that have looked at different types of behaviors, comparing people who have, basically they look at populations and they can do a blood draw and they can identify from the blood draw if you have been exposed or infected with that parasite based on some immune response that a signal they can see in your blood. And then they can look at behaviors. So I remember reading one study about aggressive driving behaviors, and there was a correlation. So maybe not a direct cause and effect, but at least correlation between having the evidence that you had been parasitized by that parasite and aggressive driving behaviors. And there's dozens of these papers out there now. So the evidence suggests that this parasite really does cause some changes in host behavior. And it shouldn't really be surprising because in the natural environment, if we remove humans from the situation, we can look at all sorts of different hosts who are manipulated by their parasite. Their behaviors change when they're parasitized. And so the parasite really does cause that host to act differently. Now, fish aren't driving cars, but they might be swimming at a different part of the water column so that a bird can swoop down and eat the fish. And now the bird gets the parasite because it's one of those complex life cycles that transmitted through the food chain. So
awesome. Cool. Thank you. Next question is from Dolly. Are parasites able to be in mutualistic relationships?
Yeah, so that is a really great question. I said that parasites have the ability to cause harm. And the funny thing about parasitism is that most parasites don't want to kill their host because they need to get either out of that host to get into the environment, or they need to get into another host. And so that degree of harm is kind of on a spectrum. Some of the parasites, or most of the parasites I work on, we don't really see major harm in terms of big ulcers or, really things that are like, oh, that doesn't look like a healthy animal that has a parasite. They look pretty healthy most of the time. There are some circumstances where we can see that they have, they look less healthy, right? And so I think it's a spectrum. And so a lot of the parasites are probably on that side of the spectrum that don't cause a ton of harm. But the ones that we know really well, like the ones that parasitize humans, we have good documentation of what kind of harm they do cause their host. So those do fall more into the more harmful, and there's lots that fall into less harmful, more mutualistic relationship. But I love that question.
Awesome. Thank you. Next comes from Aiden in 5th grade in Highland Elementary, Lake Stevens, Washington. Do we eat parasites?
We can. So humans, I didn't mention it because I don't work on human parasites, but humans are known to have, let me rephrase that. There are over 200 species of parasites that can infect humans. Now, at any given time, I am currently not aware that I have any parasites, but you could have parasites. And do we eat them? It depends. There are certain foods that serve as what we call that intermediate host, that first host where the larval development stage is. And if you eat those foods and they have the larvae and they're not cooked properly, then the adults could develop in your body, or you could encounter them in the environment. So that might be consumption if, say, you're playing in the dirt and then you put your dirty hands to your mouth and you consume an egg accidentally. So yes, there are definitely ways where humans could consume parasites, most of the time not intentional though.
Sounds good. I was like literally just gardening yesterday and I'm like, oh boy,
I
definitely wash my hands after, but I was thinking about roundworms and stuff while I was gardening. All right, our next question is from Tina. If someone loves to eat medium rare steak or sashimi, how can you avoid or treat parasites?
Okay, wonderful question. The thing about transmission to humans, it kind of depends on what part of the world you're in. Some parts of the world, there's more parasite transmission. And in other parts of the world, there's less parasite transmission. So you have to kind of take that into consideration. Now, eating undercooked and raw meat is definitely a risk factor. So if you cook your meat properly or don't eat raw meat, then you have much less risk than if you do consume those foods. And then second of all, depending on what types of regulations there are in place for monitoring food safety, that is also going to drastically reduce your risk of becoming parasitized if you eat foods that have the potential to harbor those parasites. So in some parts of the world, there are fewer regulations. In other parts of the world, there are much more strict regulations on food safety. So in general, most sushi grade fish in the US is pretty safe. In other parts of the world, that's maybe not the case. So we do see parts of the world that have higher rates of transmission and parts of the world that have lower rates of transmission. So it's not, I eat medium rare steak. I'm not a big fan of sashimi, but that's more of a texture thing for me. But yeah, that's definitely something you have to consider.
Cool. Thanks. I'm definitely eating foods both in those high risk categories. So
yeah.
I'm not going to stop.
It's okay.
Sounds good. All right. So we've got Kindly, also from 5th grade. How big can parasites be?
Oh my gosh. I love this. So I'm going to move my head just a second. Can y'all see this is a parasite behind me. Mm-hmm. And that's like a big picture, but that tapeworm is only like a millimeter, and it's multiple cells. So teeny, tiny. So parasites can be really, really tiny, but some tapeworms, which I think tapeworms are probably the largest parasites. Now I might be wrong, but I think some tapeworms can be the largest parasites. And so oftentimes they kind of mirror the size of their host. So I've seen videos of tapeworms from bears that are meters long, or whales meters long, where other tapeworms and other parasites can be teeny tiny, a single cell or just, a millimeter. Yeah. Cool. Or less.
Good. We've got Cooper and Harper, both separately want to know, how long can parasites live?
Oh, it kind of depends. Some parasites have pretty quick life cycles, meaning that they go through that whole developmental stage within maybe a growing season. It kind of depends on who you live in and when they are active, right? If you parasitize an insect and an insect is only flying between June, July, August, September, where you live, then that parasite would have to complete its life cycle and then kind of go dormant over the winter. And so it kind of just depends on what kind of parasite you are, where you live in the world and the environment. And then, in some of the tapeworms that I work on, those sharks and rays might be several years old. And if they eat the right type of, say, snail or mollusk that has the larval form, they might have that tapeworm for their whole lifetime. So it kind of depends on the age of the host and when they get infected also.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Nice.
A number of folks have asked, can parasites be deadly?
Yes, they can be deadly. And if we're just looking at humans, there are definitely parasites that can cause death in humans. Again, it kind of depends on where you live. If you have access to modern medicine, preventatives, drug treatments, if you do get infected, or if you lack access to those things. And the other thing that you have to consider is if you just have a couple of them, it might not cause you much problem at all. It might be a minor inconvenience for a couple of days until you clear the infection or get treatment. And if you have a lot of them, you'll have more severe symptoms and side effects and harm done that could ultimately lead to death. And then if we don't think about humans, because I always like to put it into perspective that there's lots of other organisms out there. Yeah, we can see some organisms that are just very heavily parasitized. And now, of course, if you're just living out in the environment, you're not going to get medicine to get rid of those parasites. And it might ultimately lead to death over time if they have a really high parasite load. Mm-hmm.
Sounds good. All righty. The next question. How do you know that you've been infected with a parasite? Like, can you feel it? Do you go to the doctor and they tell you? Like, how do you figure that all out?
Yeah, usually something's just not feeling right. And then you would go to the doctor, and then kind of going back to those career options, they might do a fecal test or a blood test. And because parasites often get transmitted in one of those two ways, they would be able to diagnose you based on some laboratory preparations where they could identify an egg or a parasite in the blood or in the fecal sample.
Cool, thank you. Our next question is from Spencer. What's the scariest parasite you've ever seen?
Oh, wow. Oh, the scariest parasite that I've personally ever seen. There is a really kind of wacky parasite that lives in the brain of fish, like tuna and their relatives. And I got to see that in the Gulf of Mexico. That's really cool. So that's what I've personally seen. But the scariest parasite that I am aware of, because I teach parasitology too. Oh my, probably these blood worms. They're called blood flukes or schistosomes that humans can get infected with, because they have the ability to evade our immune system, and we don't really have a good treatment or preventative for them.
That's pretty scary. My most spooky parasite to me is the ones that, I'm a marine biologist. So the ones that, like the isopods that eat the tongue of the fish, and then they just sit where the tongue is supposed to be. Those are spooky. Those
are very creepy.
Yeah. They're not the scariest, but I don't want one. That's for sure. We've got Christian wants to know, what do parasites eat when they're infecting their host?
It depends on what type of parasite you are. So like tapeworms, so that's my area of expertise, they are just absorbing nutrients. So they live in the intestine, right? So what is your intestine doing? It's absorbing all of those nutrients that you had with your lunch or your breakfast, wherever you are, right? And so they're just kind of sitting in this soup of nutrients, and then they get to acquire some of them. But other parasites feed on blood cells, and other parasites pick up nutrients that like vitamins and things that the organism really does need to survive. And then you don't get enough of that vitamin, and that could make you sick. Yeah, so blood and nutrients, it kind of just depends on what you are.
Fair enough. All right. Scott wants to know, do you need a college degree to become a parasitologist?
So it kind of depends. I feel like that's my answer for everything. It kind of depends.
That's always true in biology. There's never one answer for all the things.
That's true. Yeah. So definitely you could, after you graduate from high school, you could get employment in an industry job and learn techniques there, and you may end up working with parasites. You could go to a community college and get an associate's degree, and that would give you a little bit more of a leg up. And again, you could go and work in a veterinary like pharmaceuticals, in terms of like, they need people to run tests, and you would basically learn how to do those tests on the job. So it could be veterinary or human medicine. So there are entry-level jobs at, after high school, after an associate's degree in a community college, or after a bachelor's degree. And then if you want to be the person who is really working on developing, say, a drug treatment or other things related to parasites, then you would probably need to go on and get a PhD. But I would say that there are opportunities to work with parasites all along the spectrum, from straight out of high school. You could work with, say, the forestry or wildlife departments. But if you had an associate's or a bachelor's degree, there might be other options as well. And then again, if you get a PhD, even more options in terms of the types of work that you might do.
Awesome.
I love that question, though.
Lots and lots of options.
Lots of options.
Working with parasites. Awesome. Daniel would like to know, did you experience bot flies in Belize? And for the rest of us, could you tell us what a bot fly is?
So first, no, I have not experienced a bot fly. Whew, yes. But my good friend and colleague, who has also worked in Central America, has had a bot fly and had to have it removed. And B, what is a bot fly? That is when a fly larval form lives under your skin and it's developing, and then it's going to become an adult fly. So it has to get out of your skin. And it's very painful from what I've read and heard. So I'm thankful that I have not had a bot fly.
Good, same. I have managed to avoid that myself so far. My friend Phil is a bug scientist, and he has gone to tropical places where bot flies live many times throughout his career. And he's like, getting a bot fly was on his bucket list. It's not on my bucket list.
No.
I don't want to get a bot fly,
No.
but he finally got one. This was maybe like a year and a half ago. And he was so excited. And he was like posting about his bot fly as it grew. So gross, but it makes Phil happy.
That is a drop in his bucket. I don't want that drop.
He got to check that off the bucket list. I'm happy for him. All right. Melanie would like to know, are parasites ever good for the ecosystem?
Oh, yeah. I would say yes, they are. I said they're so common, right? Probably half of all organisms actually have a parasitic lifestyle. And so they are just part of the normal functioning of an ecosystem. And so the way that nutrients move through an ecosystem and the energy flows through an ecosystem, those parasites are just part of that process. Can it get out of hand? Could there be kind of an outbreak of a certain parasite that causes harm to the ecosystem? Yes, absolutely. But you could just walk outside and check out all those organisms that are outside or in a pond, in a stream, and they all have parasites, and the ecosystem is probably doing fine. So I think that they're a healthy part of the ecosystem, and they're all around us, and we often just don't see them or think about them or acknowledge them and what role they play in the ecosystem.
For sure. Cool.
Great question.
Yeah. Yami would like to know, do parasites ever have legs?
Yes, they do. Again, it depends on where you live on your host. So we consider ticks and fleas and mites to be parasites, and they're arthropods, and they have legs. And there are other parasitic insects. There are parasitic wasps. And so, yes, some parasites can have legs and other parasites, no.
Depends on the parasite. So many ways to be a parasite.
Yeah.
Awesome. Maisie's got a question for us. Have parasites ever been used to help treat some other disease or disorder in human or animal medicine?
Oh, that's amazing. That's a lovely question. And the answer is yes, actually. So because parasites are a natural part of our bodies, like humans have been encountering parasites forever, there are some treatments for autoimmune diseases. So if a human has something like Crohn's disease or really, tummy problems, right? Irritable bowel syndrome, things like that. There have been some methods developed where humans might be treated with parasites or parts of parasites that would trigger an immune response so that your body will stop attacking yourself, because that's what an autoimmune disease is, and try to attack that parasite that you are using as kind of a medicine, right? Now, I'm going to say that with a caveat that you should not try to do this on your own. You should work with your doctor. And if that's an option in terms of treatment, then they would be the best person to give you that mode of action. But they have definitely been used for things like autoimmune diseases to alleviate some of those symptoms.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Spencer wants to know, do parasites sleep?
Oh. I don't know.
Sometimes we don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It might depend on what type of parasite you are. Some parasites are like fish. So if fish sleep, then maybe those types of parasites sleep.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Let's see. How many parasites can infect one shark?
Oh, this is such a cool question. First of all, it depends what type of shark you are, or ray. I like the rays a little bit better. That's just because that's the kind of parasites that I study. But we can see, depending on what type of shark you are and in what part of the ocean you live in, if you live in warmer waters or colder waters, or if you live in deeper waters or shallower waters, you have different parasites. So those sharks and rays that live in warmer waters and more in shallower waters tend to have more parasites, more tapeworms. And sometimes we see 6, 8, 12 different species in a single shark or ray. And when I say species, that means there might be 5, 10, 20, 100 of one species, and then some of another species and some of another. So a single animal might have hundreds of individual parasites, and it might have 5 to 12 different species or more.
Wild. So many parasites.
Yes, so many.
Bluey Williams's class wants to know, can parasites infect each other?
Yes. There are some cases of hyperparasitism where a parasite is parasitized by another parasite. And maybe the easiest one for that is if there is like a parasite that is infecting like a tick, and then the tick is parasitizing a deer or something like that. That would be the easiest one and like the one that I can think of most quickly, but there are definitely cases in which a parasite is inside of another parasite that's on a host.
Cool. Misty would like to know, have you ever named a parasite after yourself? And how do you go about naming all of these parasites that you find?
That's a cool question. So there's kind of a rule that you're not supposed to name it after yourself, but my good friend in grad school did name a parasite after me. So it's Enteropora joannae. And so that one has been named after me. And then I have named other parasites after other people who have kind of influenced my work or were maybe instrumental in getting those specimens. Yeah. And then the name, it doesn't have to be named after a person. You might name the parasite after its characteristics. I love to tell the story of this one tapeworm that slide that I showed with all of the gray pictures. That's called the Scolex. And the Scolex of this one tapeworm we named, it means pillow head. It just looks like it has a big pillow on top. And so we named it pillow head.
That's cute.
Well, actually pillow head is not the name. I'm so sorry. The word is Stoibocephalum, which means pillow head in Greek. So or Latin. It's a Latin word that we made that basically translates to pillow head.
Very cute.
Okay.
All right, cool. Let's see. Laura Robinette Minor would like to know, how do people end up, or animals end up getting parasitic tapeworms? Where do they come from? Is it from swimming, from drinking water, from eating pork? Like, how does it all happen?
So humans can get tapeworms from a couple of different ways. Mostly it's eating undercooked meat, and that there's not a ton of tapeworms that parasitize humans, really just about a handful or so. And so either undercooked meat like pork or beef, or fish. Those are kind of the main categories for human parasite transmission. Couple of other examples could have arthropods, vectors, or sheep. But mostly for humans, that's the life cycle.
Sounds good. All right. We've got a question from Dolly. So I think this is maybe because people are watching The Last of Us. Do you think that Ophiocordyceps unilateralis parasites will be able to affect humans in the future?
No. First of all, is that the species in the show? Because I haven't
seen the show because I don't want to cry. And I know that I'm going to cry if I watch Last of Us. The world is sad as it is for me.
There are examples of parasites that infect other organisms that can enter the human population. And that's called spillover. I would be I wouldn't be concerned about it.
Cool. Sounds good. Carol would like to know, how do parasites travel?
With their host, mostly. So let's think about like in the ocean. If a fish can swim from, the Gulf of Mexico in Mississippi over to the Caribbean down in South Florida or the Caribbean islands, and then it gets eaten. Now it's in a different host, and that host might go all the way down to Brazil or up the eastern seaboard to South Carolina. So that's how parasites are transmitted, or how they travel, is through their host mostly. And then some can be found, or a lot of parasites are also found in the soil. And so they're not really moving anywhere unless the soil is moved or you disturb it, and then they maybe kind of go into the air. But yeah, they move with their host.
Cool. Sounds good. Kyla would like to know, do all parasites look scary? Are there any cute parasites?
I mean, isn't that cute? I think they're cute.
You think they're cute? Okay. Sounds good to me. Cute is in the eye of the beholder.
It is. It really is.
Oh, it's really true. Let's see. Mari would like to know, what can lead to the extinction of a parasite species?
That's really a great question, because there are lots of animals and plants that we know of right now that are free living, that are under pressure of going extinct, or their populations are in decline. And all of those organisms probably harbor at least one parasite. So if their hosts are threatened, or are facing deforestation, or maybe where they live in the ocean is getting too warm or becoming too acidic because of climate change, that might drive the host towards extinction, which could lead the parasites into extinction as well, right? So even though we hear mostly about those big organisms that you can see going extinct, you have to imagine that each of those big organisms probably has 2, 3, 4, 10 or more parasites that would also be facing extinction.
Bummer. Sounds good. All right. Garden Spot Garden Spot Secondary Campus would like to know, why aren't viruses considered parasites? Is it only because they're not considered living?
Yes, that's what I would say. I would say that they basically act like a parasite, but we don't consider viruses a living thing. I mean, I think that scientists even debate that, but I'm in the camp that they're not living.
Cool.
Same with bacteria, just to elaborate, like bacteria and then parasites act very similar in many ways, but we consider bacteria just separate and then limit parasites to those things that aren't bacteria. So
one thing that comes up again and again in biology is that historically we've tried to like put life into neat little boxes, and life doesn't really work like that. Like life is complex and in between, and So the deeper you go into learning biology, the more you realize that the boxes that we try to put on things in it's just people trying their best to understand a complicated situation.
Absolutely. Love that.
For sure. All right. Ingrid wants to know, have you ever had to deworm wildlife, or does nature seem to keep a natural balance?
I have personally never had to deworm, but I do give my dog heartworm preventatives and flea and tick medicine. So in that case, definitely preventing that disease transmission so that my dog stays healthy and, or your cat, something like that. But otherwise, I just let nature be nature.
Sounds good. Kara would like to know, how far have you traveled in the pursuit of parasites?
The farthest location that I've personally gone is to Vietnam.
What were you collecting in Vietnam? Sharks and rays?
Yep, sharks and rays. And we were working with some scientists there and worked in the local fish markets and collaborated with fishermen. And that's how we did our work there. Awesome.
Thank you. All right. We have answered 57 questions today, and there are still 39, but we've hit 45 minutes. So we're going to wrap it up. But as a reminder, everybody at home/school, if you want to have a session for just your group about parasites or about anything else, you can always request a session for free at skypeascientist.com for your group, so you can get all of your classes questions answered at a time that works for you. But we always end our sessions with the same 2 questions. The first question: if you had everyone's attention in the whole world and you could tell them one thing about your area of expertise, what would you tell them?
That parasites are everywhere. Have to zoom in and see them everywhere. Yep.
Great. Cool. All right. Next question. You still have everybody's attention in the world. You can tell them one thing about absolutely anything. It can be serious, significant, meaningful, or it could be silly and just something that you want people to know.
Okay. So as an educator, I think that my one piece of advice for students would be to keep an open mind and explore options. And don't be set on just like a very narrow path, because you never know where you might end up if you keep your options open.
That's great. That's really great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we wrap today?
That's all. I think I'm set.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for sharing all of your pictures and knowledge with us today. Everybody, we will see you again. We've got 2 more sessions for this semester. We're going to be doing cold oceans, all in the Arctic, and then warm oceans in reefs. So we're going to be doing 2 very different types of ocean ecosystems. So get pumped for that. We will see you at the next one. And thank you, Ellen, for interpreting for us today. We appreciate you. All right. Bye, everybody.